Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Pepis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Brian Gillis, Professor of Art and Coordinator of Ceramics in the College of Design at the University of Oregon. Gillis is a multidisciplinary artist who uses a variety of production strategies and conceptual approaches, often drawing from specific sites and related institutions. His work ranges from the production of objects and additions of multiples to site-specific installations and actions. Gillis also serves as the director of the Center for Art Research in the 510 Oak Building, which houses 22 artist studios in downtown Eugene. Gillis's distinctions include fellowships from the Illinois Arts Council, the Oregon Arts Commission, and the MacDowell Colony, and residencies at the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art, International Ceramic Research Center in Denmark, and Arizona State University School of Arts, Media, and Engineering. Thank you, Brian, for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So let's start at the beginning. Tell us about your background and how you came to be an artist.
Okay. I grew up in Los Angeles in a family of people who I think were interested in art but didn't have a background in art. And in the Los Angeles Unified School District in the 80s and 90s, there was no art. So I came to art by way of graffiti. Mm-hmm. And that led me to be interested in graphic design when pursuing my undergraduate education. And when I started to pursue that, I think I thought a lot about what it means to be in college and how I felt that it was an opportunity to consider ways to kind of fill myself up. And so while I was there, I was really interested in taking as many different classes as I could, and I always took extra classes in history and science and art with the idea that maybe if I filled myself up enough, I'd understand where to go from there. And I think early on I found ceramics and sculpture to be really kind of technical and related to things that I was interested in history and related sociocultural issues, and I kind of pursued those from there.
So what attracted you to becoming a professor of art?
You know, I think it was simultaneously the opportunity to continue to be in school and to be involved in critical discourse, and the awareness that I could lead with not knowing and use the kind of moment of being an educator as really a community facilitator and get down into some things that I was interested in and use the occasion of being a part of a community to understand things further.
So tell us a little bit about some of the things that you're interested in, the issues, the topics, or the problems that you try to address in your work.
You know, I think I'm interested in ways that historic moments of tension are still legible in existing social currents, and ways that access to that information is maybe limited by institutional structures or things like that. So a lot of what I've been doing as of late is identifying gaps in the availability of information and trying to work with institutions to make that information available.
So can you tell us about a specific piece or a specific project?
Yeah. A couple of years ago, I did a project at the Illinois State Museum, at the Illinois State University, that was kind of focused on trying to connect people to information related to the assassination of Fred Hampton. And Illinois State University is a federal repository of various documents from court proceedings to FBI reports and things like that. And I found, so I had been thinking about the assassination of Fred Hampton, who is the spokesperson for the Black Panther Party in 1968 as a 21-year-old. And I'd been looking into this narrative and trying to see what was available at the libraries at Illinois State Museum and different libraries in the state of Illinois and found that there was no information about them, about him, the Black Panthers, and various other things that were happening in the late 60s. And so I set out to find all that information and worked with the library there and some other libraries in the state to accession books that I made. And through an installation that offered the audience the experience to walk through a 15-foot field of Illinois flags where you're feeling kind of suffocated and kind of end up in this stack of books that's all the books that the Milner Library had related to Panthers, civil rights, etc. And there was this little antechamber where they had access to all these books and a photocopy machine. And there was a looped image of the bed that Fred Hampton was assassinated in. And there was information about how his assassination was kind of proven in the 90s to have been done by a joint force with the Chicago police, the FBI, and the federal marshals. And two of the people who were involved in that committed suicide at that time after bringing it up. At the end of the project, the Milner Library accessioned those books, and there is various people in various programs who agreed to use the books as a part of their classes.
So say you've begun to talk about this, but say a little bit more generally about what you hope viewers or participants in your work, how they'll, what you're hoping they'll learn or what they'll gain, or what's your kind of ideal for the interaction between a viewer and the work that you make?
I think ultimately I'm hoping that people are afforded access to something that maybe are just below the surface, that can better inform an awareness of the kind of world that they're living in. And I think more and more I want to do it in such a way that my hand is completely invisible. And I'm really thinking the ultimate manifestation of this is some sort of public art manifestation that is kind of void of an artist's name, and it's maybe just completely about the archive. But I've been thinking a lot about information and access to information as this kind of catalytic thing that affords somebody a new way to kind of consider their world.
Fascinating, fascinating. So I'm going to shift some gears now and start talking about some of the other aspects of what you do. Let's talk about the 510 Oak Building. So what is the 510 Oak Building and how did it come about?
The 510 Oak Building are the research spaces for the studio faculty in the School of Art and Design, which is the Department of Art and Department of Product Design. Before, I guess, November of 2018, most of us had research spaces all over Eugene. The majority of those were on campus in some capacity. And with shifting buildings and priorities on campus, we were losing some of those spaces, and our administration and upper administration recognized how valuable and important it is that we have those spaces. And from the outside, it seemed like they moved mountains to get us this building. And I think it ends up being a monument to the university's commitment to research, to practice-based research on campus and to what we do.
And why is it important that the studios are not on campus? Is that important, I guess I should
You
ask.
know, I don't know that it is. I had a studio on campus, I guess, for 8 years before moving off campus, and I think that our department has a culture of understanding that faculty are available in the capacity of being their faculty, but also that we're independent researchers. And so for the most part, although our studios might be right adjacent to classrooms, I think people understand, respect, and really honor that we're working artists. That said, being farther away, I do think allows me as an artist to kind of get into a more focused headspace, because I'm not walking through our facilities and, you know, understanding, you know, this door is open and I have to send an email, and, you know, I could really just focus on my work. The other thing is I think that we are in some ways invisible to the community of Eugene, and parking's an issue, and the various things that we do are just not porous. So I think having this gorgeous building right in the heart allows us to kind of be this beacon in a really great way.
And you've opened up the building during Friday art walks and things like that, so that the community can become aware of what's going on there.
Yeah.
So another thing about the 510 Oak Building is that it houses the Center for Art Research, or Cfar for short, which you direct. Mm-hmm. So what prompted the creation of Cfar?
Well, maybe 3-4 years ago, an alumnus approached us with the question of, if we had resources for something related to research, what would we do? And so the Department of Art discussed this at length in various capacities through committees and faculty meetings, and we just kept coming back to the idea of practice-based research and thinking about the difference between practice and maybe somehow trying to understand what art is as something that comes from a practice on the backside. And so we conceived of this center as a platform for experimentation and exchange that's rooted in art practice. And it feels really exciting and really fresh. I think precedent for this in universities is really related to primarily writing about or talking about. It's through the lens of maybe art historians or critical writers or things like that. A lot of them are focused on maybe art and ecology or art and technology or the arts more interdisciplinarily. And this is really about contemporary studio art practice. Mm-hmm. And we're kind of building this ship as we're flying it, so to speak. And we've conceived of it as something that has 4 basic tenets: research, discourse, exhibition, and publication. And we want all of these tenets to be rooted in speculative inquiry, something that is not necessarily about performing knowledge, but something where this platform affords artists, art writers, designers, whoever's engaging us, to do something that they couldn't otherwise do in their normal life or elsewhere in the world.
So you've spoken about practice, research practice, and the title is the Center for Art Research. So I think there are places on this campus and places off this campus when people, if you said practicing artists, they're doing research, people would say, research?
Right.
So say a little bit about how the collective understands this idea of art research and why that's an important idea.
I think with the advent of this center, it's allowed us to think about that more and have conversation about this more. And I think we've come to realize that in an academic landscape, because of these promotion and tenure moments, we're creating narratives that need to be legible to people outside the field. And at this institution and the 2 others I've been involved in, I've seen that what ends up happening is artists try to use the language of other disciplines without really knowing what those disciplines are. There are artists who make a mark and respond, and it's completely intuitive and formal. And then there's artists who have what might be called a research-based practice, where they do tons of academic research and tons of writing, and then the work comes from a plan that comes from that. Mm-hmm. And so I think a part of what's difficult, and I think most fields have this difficulty because there's so many subspecializations, but what's difficult for us is how to kind of think of our research within the academic landscape as something that doesn't use the language of other fields. And so it's called the Center for Art Research to kind of position art as research, the practice of art as research, studio inquiry as research. So in other words, it could be some sort of way that an artist might be making marks and responding or things that are intuitive. That practice could be considered research, where there's some sort of position that's being taken, some sort of action, and some sort of outcome.
So I know that you sponsor events. There are publications that come from Cfar. One of them that's relevant that I attended to what you're talking about it was called 5 by 10 at 510. So tell us about that event.
Well, I think as we gain momentum and learn more about our capacity and what we want to be, it becomes more and more clear that we are not interested in performing knowledge. In other words, we don't want to invite people here for just the benefit of an audience. We want the way that they engage us to benefit their work. And so this event that you went to, the idea was we were going to invite 10 artists to speak for 5 minutes about their work, and that would give them the occasion to, a typical talk is about an hour. It would give them the occasion to have to think about the kind of foundational principles of their practice, think about the form of communication with an audience, and the way that we're positioning it for those guests and for the audience is that this is simultaneously intended to be as beneficial to the person speaking as it is to the audience. Another way that we're doing that's really exciting to me is we've been doing this series of what we call Catalytic Conversations. And so an artist or writer might be in town to do a lecture through the department, a typical lecture, and then we will give them the opportunity to work with us to have a conversation around something that's in progress. And so it could be a question or a book that's being written or a project that they're doing in their studio, or maybe just some things they're trying to get their mind around. And based on that focus, we'll assemble a group of up to 20, 25 people that are specifically related to what that topic is. And then it ends up being a 2-hour conversation over lunch where very often they're seeding the conversation with some sort of prompt or reading. And then our community and the people we invite to be a part of the community at that time respond to in service of that person's work.
I know one of the pillars is publications. So
Yeah.
say something about that aspect of what Cfar does.
I think with all 4 of the pillars, we're interested in examining kind of the full breadth of what's possible. And that in case of publication, that may be some sort of monograph or anthology, or it could also be some sort of editioned sculptural multiples or some sort of broadcast otherwise. I think with that, it's important to us that we're not just documenting work, but using the work of publication itself to kind of generate new knowledge or interrogate existing knowledge in some way. Next year, a lot of what I've been trying to do as the first director is try to figure out what's possible. And so we've been experimenting with every form we could think of. Next year is my last year in this position, and we want to experiment with what it means to have a theme that drives programming. And so our theme next year is going to be based on power, based on trying to understand what power is, has been, and could be, ways that it manifests in the world. And we are initiating something that we're calling Papers on Power. And this is a series of commissioned papers that are going to start to be published through our website first and through e-blasts. And I think the first one is slated for May. And then at the end of the year, there will be a publication, a hard publication that's going to have all of those papers in the publication, and then we're going to send them to 400 people around the country, arts writers, artists, curators, and libraries as a way to kind of seed further conversation about power.
Fascinating, fascinating. So Cfar is housed in the same space as the research studios of the faculty. How do you understand the relationship between those two cohabiting bodies of people?
This is a really interesting challenge for us because we don't see Cfar as having a site. We see Cfar as being an amorphous, fluid entity that is related to the Brain Trust, that is the research faculty in the Department of Art, but is responsive and can be anywhere. So we've had some exhibitions there and some conversations there, but I think more and more starting next year there's going to be more Cfar activity in the region, across the country, and around the world that isn't necessarily cited there. That said, it says Center for Art Research on the building. And so I think, if nothing else, it's a really important way to kind of make visible that it is something concrete and that there is a space where people are engaging these type of practices, but it's not bound to that site in the way a typical center is.
So, apropos of that, I know that there's one or two events that are upon us. By the time this video airs, they will have happened. But say a little bit about, just for an example, of the talk that's happening tomorrow that is not happening at 510.
Yeah, so tomorrow there's a talk by Garth Clark, who is a renowned craft writer, thinker, curator, gallerist, who has been touring his final lecture called A Necessary Irritant, and that final lecture is going to culminate at the Portland Art Museum in a lecture that was initiated by the Center for Art Research and is in partnership with them and Eutectic Gallery. And then following that, he and 12 other craft luminaries from around the country are going to meet at Cfar and have a conversation about craft through the structure of a hyperobject, Tim Morton's hyperobject, as a way to understand craft in fresh ways that's not supplemental related to other disciplines. And that conversation is going to be transcribed. It's going to be annotated in succession by 3 annotators, combined with auxiliary writings, and then that's going to be sent out to 300, 400 people around the country as a way to seed further discourse around craft thinking.
Say what a hyperobject is.
Well, a hyperobject is something that in some ways can't be discretely known or understood by one of its variables. It's so massive and phasing and non-local that you can't know it all at once in a way. So Tim Morton uses global warming as an example of a hyperobject. And as I've been thinking a lot about craft and just developing more and more open questions and not really completely able to understand it as something it is Western and non-Western, ancient, contemporary, in industry, in the cottage. I have had so many open questions about what craft is, and when I came to the hyperobject, I couldn't help but read this book thinking about craft as a hyperobject. So we put together this group of thinkers to kind of help understand the potential for thinking of craft through the structure of the hyperobject.
Fascinating. So it's already clear from the conversation that we're having that you're not just a practicing artist and the director of Cfar, but you're also an educator. So tell us about a course that you teach and how you approach that, the whole project of being a professor of art practice.
A class that I'm really excited about right now is something that's industrial ceramics. When I was coming up in ceramics in the 90s, there was almost a complete loss of industry in North America and the beginning of a pretty substantial loss of industry in Europe. And none of us understood how to make objects with any sort of industrial precision or using those methods. And so for the last 25 years, I've been trying to understand this. And, you know, it's actually kind of gotten to the point where it's almost like the loss of language in some ways. So a lot of what I did was go to kind of Chinese factories where they would let people see how they do things and try to talk to old-timers who might have been educated in the 30s and 40s and then really just try to make things up myself. And there's my generation of educators from the 90s have started to do this and kind of resuscitate industrial production related to ceramics. So this class right now that we're doing, we're working on tableware related to the annual product design feast that they do. And this is a really wonderful initiative where there's a senior studio that product design runs, where they make everything for a feast. Tables, linens, lights, tableware, and then it's catered family style, and they put a bunch of strangers together in long tables and just talk and think about objects and things like that. So the way that I am running this class is as an independent study consortium, where there's a lot of demonstrations and the typical chalk and talk, but it's all about trying to model a professional practice where there's tons of iterative development, tons of model making and sketching and research for precedent related to the forms that they're pursuing. And I work with all 18 of them independently to kind of realize the first prototype of their project. And then once that happens, there's a jurying moment that happens with their peers and visitors and product design and art faculty that jury the top 3 designs to be the tableware for the feast.
Fascinating. So, Brian, we have just a couple of minutes left, so this will be my last question. Can you tell us about something you're working on now, a project that you're engaged with? When you leave us, you're going to go down to 510. What are you going to work on?
Well, I've been thinking a lot about Foster's rule and the way that organisms on islands grow or shrink generationally relative to resources. And I've been trying to figure out ways to mark that relative to North America and kind of sociocultural issues. And so I'm working on a series of what's essentially going to be a room full of models that are disproportionately large or small relative to what you're used to seeing. And they'll be cast in this marbled stone-looking clay. And hopefully it'll look like some sort of mud flow of objects. And when you look closer, you can see that some are, you might be curious as to why the scale has shifted.
Well, we'll look forward to getting an opportunity to see how that comes out. Thank you so much for talking to us today about your career, your practice, Cfar, 510, and your teaching.
Thanks, Paul.
It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, thanks.
I've been speaking with Brian Gillis, Professor of Art at the College of Design at the University of Oregon and the Director of UO's Center for Art Research. Thanks so much for watching.